Hi, my name is Caroline Lloyd. I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about a few of the myths of grief. It'll be a very short video on covering about 4 of the major myths that come up time and time again. I am the author of Grief Demystified with Jessica Kingsley Publishers. I have over 30 years experience, both as a volunteer and in paid work with terminally ill patients, with anticipatory grief, and also with the bereaved. I have been extensively involved with cruise bereavement care and road peace, supporting people after road crashes. I am an academic and just finishing the end of a 4-year PhD at Trinity College Dublin in bereavement. And I am a trainer and I run workshops and give presentations, including keynote presentations on grief. I'm also the co-creator of a new bereavement theory called the multidimensional theory of bereavement, in conjunction with Professor McGuckin at Trinity College Dublin. The journal article publishing our new model and theory will be in the Bereavement Care Journal sometime this year. So I shall start with my myth number 1, which is the one that pervades society continuously. And even today, I see memes, I see posts on social media talking about the stages of grief. And to start at the beginning, Elisabeth Kubler-Ross was instrumental in developing our understanding of death and dying. She was a psychiatrist who pioneered the hospice movement and worked with patients that had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. And anecdotally, she observed that her patients, when diagnosed, would go through commonalities. And she was explicit in saying that they didn't apply to all people all of the time. And for some reason, that has now been misinterpreted as applying to grief and has been converted into many a meme. And it seems to be almost like an urban myth that we go through stages of grief, when in fact we don't. So what we do have is contemporary grief theory, and the most predominant model that we use as academics or practitioners is the dual process model. It's in my book, it's explained very clearly, and it talks about how we oscillate between loss orientation or dealing with the death and restoration orientation, which is dealing with all the other stresses that occur after the death. So things like secondary losses, which is, for example, if your partner dies and they were your carer, how do you deal with the loss of the caring role? So you're immersed in the loss orientation, which is dealing with the grief and all that entails, and then trying to renegotiate life without that person in it. And both are stressors. Again, another misconception is that restoration orientation is becoming okay again, and that's absolutely not the case at all. If you read the journal article, then you'll see that they're both stressors. Number 2 grief myth is that we should all be talking about it all the time, and if we're not crying or sharing or in counselling or at groups or whatever, that we're not dealing with it properly or that we're stuck. And again, this is another urban myth. So there are different grieving styles and types. We're all different. We all deal with other stresses in life in different ways. So why would grief be any different? It's not. So the typical pattern of grieving that we expect other people to demonstrate is what's called intuitive, which is where people feel the need to tell their stories and to share their emotions. And that is tends to be portrayed in the literature. And the people who grieve in that way tend to be quite vocal because they need to express their emotions, they need some empathy, and they need to express it publicly and tell their story time and time again. So that's what you tend to see on social media, in the literature, in blogs, and so on and so forth. But the other type of griever is called instrumental, and they're people who just get on and do things. So they don't want to share their thoughts and their feelings. They are more action-based. So these are the people who go back to work or take up new hobbies or immerse themselves in gardening or running or whatever. So we really shouldn't be imposing on other people what we expect them to do. And we really should understand that everyone's an individual and just let them grieve in whatever way suits them and just support them in whatever way they need from us. And in light of what's going on at the moment with COVID-19, myth number 3 is that because some of us haven't been able to attend funerals or be with our loved ones while they were dying, that we're going to have complicated or disenfranchised grief. And the idea that there is an empathic failure is really not supported. Disenfranchised grief is when society doesn't recognize your grief or the way you're grieving or some variable. And we are all universally, globally, collectively grieving both death losses and non-death losses. So there is no empathic failure. We all understand what we're going through, what we're missing out on. And even if we're not experiencing something individually, we are understanding this collectively. And then that leads me on to grief myth number 4, that we get over it. You don't get over the loss of a loved one. That's like saying you will stop loving them. So one of the theories that supports this is called continuing bonds. And again, it's in my book. I explain what continuing bonds theory is. And it's how we adjust to the loss and reconstruct our lives moving forward, and about how we integrate that person and the love that we have for that person within our new normal. That's a term that we've always used in the grief world and the bereavement world, but is suddenly gaining traction in terms of the pandemic and coming out of lockdown and how we go forward. And another concept that people are talking about now in relation to COVID-19 is that of meaning making. How do we make sense of the world around us, and meaning reconstruction, especially in the construct of losses, whether they're death losses or non-death losses. So Professor Robert Niemeyer in the United States has been researching this and constructed this theory, which is related to grief, on meaning making and meaning reconstruction, and has been teaching on this and researching on this for over 20 years now. So that's his concept, and I understand that that this is becoming more prevalent now in light of COVID-19. So that's just a little snapshot of 4 of the predominant myths of grief. We don't have stages. We all grieve individually. We're all individual people, and our relationship with our person that dies is different to, let's say, a sister or a friend or a mother or whatever. So of course we're going to grieve differently. COVID-19 is not an empathic failure, so we would never expect disenfranchised grief, because we all understand what's going on and we're all experiencing losses ourselves. And continuing bonds, we never get over it. Never ever get over it. You will always love your loved one. We just learn to live them without them in a different way. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope this has been helpful in some way. if you'd like to know more, there's a whole book, as I say. So there's a chapter on contemporary grief theory, because Stages goes back to the 1950s. It's been debunked by all the academics, all the grief experts in the world. We have better, more modern grief theories, and I explain what they are in here and how relevant they are to the way that we live our lives in reality. There's a chapter on what to say and absolutely what not to say to a bereaved person. There's a chapter on what complicated grief is and what disenfranchised grief is. There's a chapter on for professionals on caring for yourself and to be mindful of things such as compassion fatigue. And there's also a lot of information on grieving children, how we can support children, and also on the internet and the impact of digital inheritance and digital legacies. It is an introduction to all of these themes and debunks all the myths that kind of circulate and recirculate, you know, in our environment. So I hope that's been helpful in some way. Thank you very much.